is the Trump administration recommending that organizations that rely on federal funding make payroll, pay their rent in the meantime?
It is a temporary pause, and the Office of Management and Budget is reviewing the federal funding that has been going out the door. Again, not for individual assistance, but for all of these other programs that I mentioned. I also spoke with the incoming director of OMB this morning, and he told me to tell all of you that the line to his office is open for other federal government agencies across the board. And if they feel that programs are necessary and in line with the president's agenda, then the Office of Management and Budget will review those policies. I think this is a very responsible measure. Again, the past 4 years, we've seen the Biden administration spend money like drunken sailors. It's a big reason we've had an inflation crisis in this country. And it's incumbent upon this administration to make sure, again, that every penny is being accounted for honestly.
Why?
Yes, folks, spending money like drunken sailors. That's why we put a drunken Marine in charge of the Pentagon. I'm Matt Leck with David Griscom. Hey, David.
Hey, man. How's it going?
Things
feeling right in the world?
We are, folks, at the wee part of a slippery slope that many of us have been on for our entire lifetimes, and it's hitting a juncture, let's call it.
Yeah, I mean, what a past 4 to 8 hours, frankly. This is one of those times when we got to be careful that we don't end up putting our foot in our mouths because things are moving so damn quickly. But yeah, I mean, it's been something else.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about the contours of the funding freeze a little bit later. I mean, More Perfect Union has a pretty significant tweet up kind of saying the broadest impact, which is on Medicaid funding, which is Ron Wyden's staff confirmed reports that Medicaid portals are down in all 50 states.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of other things from Meals on Wheels to cancer research. So
yeah, and we're going to spend actually a good amount of time talking about this and other ways that Democrats in particular should and don't talk about these kind of issues with Neil Meyer, who has an excellent piece in Jacobin. He has actually put together a really, really great collection of videos of the way that Democrats start speaking like populists whenever they're not in power. And I'm really looking forward to going through that all the way back to Al Gore. And that will be in the postgame at patreon.com/Left Reckoning shortly after the show.
Did you see the tweet that they dusted off from like Obama versus Romney, where it's delivering for Wall Street, not Main Street?
We love it. We love Main Street folks, don't we?
Love Main Street.
I mean, truly, you see how a lot of these folks are unable to speak normally to people anymore. And before we get to our guests, we have a really jam-packed show for y'all today. Double guests, two incredible thinkers and people. Grace Blakeley on her book, Vulture Capitalism. I really love speaking with Grace. The book is phenomenal. I highly suggest people read it. And we get into a lot about capitalism. Also some of the kind of false debates between, I don't know, what we might call conservatives and liberals about capitalism, right? The Hayek versus the Keynes thesis or way of viewing capitalism. Really, really a great kind of primer and dive into socialist politics and thought from Grace here.
I genuinely think, look, I'm a big Vivek Chibber head. I think as far as I think he's for socialists. Maybe he's more the advanced course. I think Grace, the way she communicates economics is such a common sense, but still principled way that I wish I had, say, her guidance through the Hayek Keynes polarity, 15 years ago when I was first starting to pick up a lot of this stuff. It's just very clear.
Oh, I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, you want to talk about a great guidebook for socialists? All of her books stolen before that, and also this recent one, the Vulture Capitalism, tremendous. And we have her on the program, and it's always really great speaking with her. But it's not just that. We also have Assal Rad. You want to talk about somebody who's so great at communicating very difficult and sometimes difficult to hear information. Assal joins us to talk about the Trump administration, Gaza, and what might be next for Iran. Assal is somebody who, if you haven't seen the other interviews that we've done with her, I highly suggest you go back and listen to those. She's also a must follow on Twitter. She does a lot of really great great work, sort of pushing back through the misinformation and just outright lies that we get from major American newspapers.
Yeah, as Michael would have said, two illustrious returning guests.
Yes, sir. Well, in that spirit, let's not take too much time here at the top. We got to talk about two quick things, and the message here is the working class does not have friends up at the top. And maybe to get us started, we can look at the Democrats and a company called Costco, where Costco. Well, actually, before we get to some of the ways that they have been reacting to it, Costco, and this is very significant. Costco Teamsters workers are set to strike this week as company embroiled in DEI controversy. Costco is facing a looming strike as 18,000 employees are set to walk off the job. As Costco embroiled in a public battle over DEI policies, this is Fox Business, of course. A much larger fight is looming with 18,000 store employees set to head to the picket lines if the grocery chain can't agree to a new contract by Friday. If Costco actually respects its employees, it will give our 18,000 members the wages, benefits, and work rules that they have been demanding for months. Teamsters spokesperson told Fox News Digital. Now, this is a significant strike, one, because of the work that the Teamsters have done to organize workers in Costco, along with other major American companies, right? We are seeing these really bold movements from the labor movement, things that you should be supporting if you believe in working class politics. And this is a huge potential strike. We'll definitely be covering this if it goes to a strike. I think they have until January 31st to accept. The demands of the Teamsters workers, and it's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, Costco is one of the more profitable American corporations. What they have offered people is laughable, right? And this should be something that if you are a political party, maybe a political party in opposition, a political party that might have lost an election recently, because a lot of people didn't think that you were serious enough about standing up for working people, standing up for cost of living crisis in America, standing up for the forgotten people who do the vast majority of work in American society, should be a slam dunk. Because Donald Trump and all those guys, instead of actually coming at these companies and challenging these companies on their anti-worker practices, on their anti-labor practices, are instead creating this insane false controversy about DEI. Right. But if you can't stomach that because your investors and the people backing your party would maybe get a little bit upset about it, this might be a good opportunity to maybe not take the political bait about things like DEI. And yet that's not what we've seen. As we can pull up here, this is this is apologies. Here we go. This is Reverend Al Sharpton leading a Costco buy-in, right? Encouraging people, again, this is now, to go and shop and spend money at Costco to celebrate the company announcing that it will maintain its DEI policies.
Wait, so they said we're going to not stick with the policies we put up in the last 4 years, and so now we're rewarding them by shopping
Yes.
outside of any other broader context. So it looks like it's still valuable to them, and that's why it's still there. I would say, and these other companies not seeing so much of that value. But our buddy Paul Prescott, I think, had the best way to put this. Let's see, I have it here
If you need it.
Right. So Costco reported $7.4 billion in profits last year, yet it is only offering a 3% raise to Teamsters at Costco, many of whom are not white. But I guess rewarding a corporation through shopping is progressive now. And that's the thing, is like, you'll get a certain type of person, and I want to address them now, that says we can do both. Do you think Costco thinks that? Or do they say, actually, we're going to do one of those and get the maximum amount of PR benefit from it, and we're going to say, screw the other thing. We're going to take our $7 billion in profits, and you'll get what you asked for. It is a conscious choice by these companies to use this thing for PR, just like it is a conscious choice to overthrow it for PR. Like these, like here's the thing: to the extent that you want to pursue these things and have corporations make these sort of commitments that they were making like when people were hitting the streets and really uprising. Tell them to put it in the labor contract.
Yep. Yep.
Don't tell them to
We
put
need
it on
a
the
contract.
website. Yep, put it in a labor contract, and then you have a threat to strike on the other end of it. Do not tell them, put it on your website and we'll give you some claps for it.
Because again, I mean, look, we have a lot to get to today, so we're not going to be able to like really dive deep into it. But again, because these programs are lawsuit protection programs, they are lawsuit protection programs. Because if there was a kind of an effort or an interest, for example, from the workers in a company to ensure that, as you were saying, Matt, like that diversity is respected, right? That an old boys club doesn't end up dominating those companies. Do you know who I want to be the people who are uh, managing those disputes and the people with the power in enforcing those disputes? The workers. But instead, what we get, and this is very typical of Democrat politics nowadays, is a preference for top-down policies that disempower the masses while they get to sort of present a progressive sheen to it. Now, this should be noted that, again, as we said, there are no friends, because in the same way that the Democrats and liberals and all these folks want to sort of point to things like DEI instead of defending working class people as they're set to go on strike, we are seeing an unprecedented and illegal, and I really want to stress this, folks, and we'll talk about this more with Neil in the post game, but an illegal attempt by Donald Trump to massively extend and exert power over a whole host of programs, but including the NLRB. Just reading this really quick on this labor story here. Trump fires senior labor board official in unprecedented and illegal move. Gwynne Wilcox pledges to challenge decisions after dismissal, in effect paralyzes the National Labor Relations Board. Trump has fired a senior official at the top U.S. labor watchdog, triggering a chorus of criticism from unions and in effect paralyzing the body until replacement is confirmed. Wilcox, a member and former chair of the NLRB, described her dismissal as an unprecedented and illegal and pledged to challenge the move. She's absolutely correct about this. Her removal leaves the board with only two members and leaves it without a quorum of 3 members required to issue decisions per a 2010 Supreme Court ruling. No doubt about it that what Trump is doing here is illegal, along with all of these other things that people have, I'm sure, been keeping up with today about Trump's basically Trump's decision to turn off the taps of the federal government, affecting millions upon millions of people, including 37 million children who are seeing their health insurance taken away.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, the illegality is part of the part of the point. And this is how, like, people point out, FDR had a lot of executive action going on. You have to flood the zone, and it would, and like a lot of this is, yes, I mean, sorry, I'm getting a little bit, I got a little.
No, I mean, like, and there's no doubt about it. What Trump is doing right now is he's seizing as much power as he possibly can. And anyone who had any kind of fantasies about some kind of pro-labor Trump and Trumpism, I mean, are being kind of proven absolutely incorrect at this moment. The fact of the matter is, and this is the kind of political danger that I think a lot of people in our audience and people in our kind of broader community, Matt, sometimes struggle with, right? Which is the fact that the right and Trump are absolutely anti-worker. They aren't our friends. Yeah, sure. You understand that. Correct. Great job. But these other folks equally are not your friends. The fact of the matter is that as the Trump administration is waging war on working class people, programs that people died to win in the past, we're having the Democrats say, you know what, maybe we should talk about how this is going to affect police funding, because that's really going to win folks over. People like Ted Lieu. Remember, folks, that they had a whole campaign where they tried this shit out. And guess what? It fooled nobody. They also had a whole campaign where they were unable to mount and articulate any kind of pro-working class message, any kind of politics that inspired people who were worried, rightfully, about the costs of living. Instead, they did push these kind of silly kind of corporate policies, right, that we're now seeing being pulled away. And instead of standing with working class people as they fight for a better wage, better conditions now, we're seeing them showing up to do a buy-in at a company that is 3 days away from a strike.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean that this whole broader thing, including the freeze, it really is like a takeover for the really rich in this country who look at the government as something that you can just do this stuff to. The Palantir type folks, Joel Lonsdale, Peter Thiel, even honestly, even for like the Google guys and Mark Zuckerberg, I don't think they're even that far off of this. And yeah, I don't know. It's interesting because one thing that's like kind of pointless even to mention is there's some, and what I kind of like almost brought up earlier was there's this thing going on with the Department of Labor pick that Trump has, which is Lori Chavez DeRemer, and John Hoeven is mad that she's like pro-act and thinks that, like, he says, well, we'll get into Hoeven maybe later, but it's like, yeah, there's nothing here, and it's all fake. Like I don't know.
No, I mean, I think that's put as well as you can. At the end of the day, we don't have friends up on high. And the only way that things are going to change is if working class people all across this country get serious about challenging both the ineffectiveness and weakness of the Democratic Party, but also the fundamentally antisocial, anti-people, and anti-working class mentality of the leadership of the Republican Party. And it's just kind of as simple as that. Playing any other kind of game about nudging one of them this way or that way, I think is being shown more and more to be an incorrect strategy for dealing with it. And
I'm sorry, we can't be given corporations wins, PR victories in the midst of labor fights.
It's
crazy. Just insane.
It's crazy. I mean, it just shows. I mean, honestly, it really is such a moment of showing how much that party has retreated from the working class and working class interests. But you know what? We're going to talk a lot more about this in the post game with Neil Meyer. People, be sure to join us for that. Patreon.com/leftreckoning. They go through this history of the false populist language of Democrats. But before we get there, we have an incredible show for y'all. Grace Blakeley talking about vulture capitalism, and Assal Rad on Trump, Iran, and Gaza. Stay tuned. Enjoy it, friends. And we'll see you in just a little bit in the post game.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck, and with me is David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother.
And joining us, I'm proud to say, for a second time on Left Reckoning is Grace Blakeley, an economics and politics commentator, also staff writer at Tribune, author of a few books, the most recent, Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and The Death of Freedom. Grace, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
And so the big question is, are we in a new era of politics, or is this a sort of a evolution of something? So is neoliberalism in the rear view? Grace, we have if people understood neoliberalism by Bill Clinton's "the era of big government is over," or Ronald Reagan's "small government," they might be surprised at what we're seeing now. Should they be?
Yeah, no, is basically the answer. And look, whether or not you think neoliberalism is dead, I think really depends on how you view it, what you think it is, basically. So if you take neoliberals at their word when they say that neoliberalism was an ideology that was all about shrinking the size of the state, creating space for free markets, expanding human freedom, all of these things that sound on the surface like quite nice things, then, yes, obviously that moment is over. There are, governments aren't even pretending anymore to kind of attempt to impose these principles. Instead, we see bailouts of massive corporations happening very frequently. We see in the US this very obvious cooperation between public and private actors in the form of Musk and Trump. But this isn't new. This goes back many years. If you look at, just in the last Trump administration, Rex Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil, was appointed Secretary of State. These links between the public and private sector are not new, but the kind of naked showing off that we're seeing at the moment about the kind of public-private links and the kind of almost corruption that we're really seeing across many democracies is new. So if you were to take them at their word when they said, we like free markets, we want small states, then yeah, you'd be thinking, right, okay, neoliberalism is over. But in my most recent book, Vulture Capitalism, I actually show that reading of neoliberalism isn't quite right. It's what they said they wanted, but if you read a little bit more closely, you actually see that neoliberalism always ended up producing the kinds of forms of capitalism that we're seeing today. That is kinds of capitalism in which you don't see free markets. You see huge monopolies with control over vast swathes of the world's economy, which aren't really subject to the forces of competition that you would expect in a free market society. You see governments intervening frequently and regularly to promote the interests of those corporations at home and abroad. You see them intervening very forcefully when it comes to crushing workers, when it comes to crushing social movements, and then behaving very permissively and very supportively when it comes to vested interests. And neoliberalism was always basically a kind of, it was like a Trojan horse, I suppose. You would sell people this idea about freedom, shrink the state, create more space for markets, that will make you feel free. And actually what was behind that was replacing a large state that often, provided support for workers as well as businesses with a state that acted openly and nakedly in the interests of big business alone. And in that sense, we really are just seeing a continuation.
I don't know if you've been following too much the kind of drama here as Trump creates his cabinet and his host of advisors, Elon Musk being one of those guys. And, one of the things I think is notable to your point about neoliberalism is that, one of the big focuses of Musk, and we can argue about whether or not we think he's actually going to be able to do the things he's talking about, because he usually talks a lot more than he does. But, a big focus of these guys is the kind of return to Reaganism, in the sense of like, we need to cut back the administrative state. The administrative state is too large. So, I'm curious, how you would sort of categorize or see this kind of political moment. Are we just sort of like recharging to an older form of neoliberalism? Because on the same token, on the other side, with Biden, they saw significant spending in the U.S., right? And people in the U.S. and y'all in the UK, I remember reading pieces in Tribune, writing about how, oh, wow, it seems like something has shifted now. They're spending all of this money. Are we returning to like an older form of neoliberalism? Is it a new form of neoliberalism? Is that not a good way to think about it at all?
Well, I would say we just need to think about it as good old-fashioned capitalism. And the way to understand capitalism, this is what Vulture Capitalism, my most recent book, is all about. It basically says people think that capitalism means free markets and democracy. And so we have this idea of capitalism, nice, free markets, democratic, counterposed with state socialism, which means the state controls everything and there are no markets, right? But that is a very kind of old and one-sided way of looking at things, really. Because actually existing capitalism everywhere it's ever existed has always had huge monopolistic corporations that are able to plan in the same way as you would see in a kind of centrally planned economy. Those monopolies have vast amounts of power. They don't have to listen to the market. They get to do what they want. And these societies have always relied on this close relationship between states and markets that we still see today. And, that goes all the way back to the formation of capitalism with industrialization in the UK, for example, with the East India Company, which was a private company that was used by the British state to control India, basically, as a colony. And that was a joint venture between merchants and politicians. You see this pattern throughout the entire history of capitalism. And indeed, if you go back to read Marx, for example, he said the capitalist state is nothing but a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie. Now, that is a bit far, because obviously workers have won certain rights and had wins within the state. But the idea that the left should become this movement that's defending a big and powerful capitalist state would have been absurd to early socialists. So this kind of idea we have of like big state versus small state is capitalism versus socialism is just plain wrong. What we need to see capitalism as is a class system. Now, I don't mean, middle class, working class, all these different, ways we have of understanding social mobility today. I mean, a very old understanding of class, which is some people own everything, that we need to produce things. Everyone else has to sell their labor power in order to survive. Now, capitalism is a system in which the people who own all the stuff we need to produce things get to make most of the decisions. They own all the wealth. They get to decide how that wealth is used. They largely get to decide what goes on within politics and within the state, whereas workers just have to kind of follow and do as they're told. Having said that, capitalism changes over time based on the balance of power between those two groups. So neoliberalism was basically a kind of re-grabbing of power by capital. Because during the post-war period, in the US, you had the New Deal, you had strong labor unions, workers had come together and basically made loads of demands within the state, outside the state, of businesses, of politicians, that had kind of weakened capital relative to workers. So neoliberalism wasn't about free markets, it wasn't about any of the stuff we're told that it's about. It's about basically those at the top taking power back, taking back control over society. And they did that with attacks on the labor movement by stripping away the parts of the state that supported workers and then expanding the parts of the state that supported capital. So we just need to throw away this kind of big state, small state thing and start looking at things in terms of class power. And in that sense, we do get to see the kind of continuation. One thing I will point out, which I think is really instructive, there's a chapter in my book in which I look at the origins of the Ford Motor Company. Now, I do this as a way of saying capitalist planning has existed since the origins of this system. This was happening at the first half of the 20th century. Henry Ford started this motor company, became one of the biggest monopolies on the planet, became extremely powerful, went to war with the labor movement. So really kind of beat up striking workers half the time, exerted huge amounts of control over what workers can do. He's famous for introducing the $5 day. But this was actually a day that was a $2.50 wage and then an extra $2.50 if you did what Henry Ford said you had to do. Things like your wife isn't allowed to work outside the home, you're not allowed to drink. It was like the imposition of a very rigid set of kind of strictures around the lives of workers. He was also had a very close relationship with the American state and actually with the Nazi German state. And he was one of the people that was mentioned positively in Hitler's Mein Kampf because he was so ardently anti-Semitic. And again, Henry Ford preached about free markets whilst having very close relationships with the American government, with the German government, relying on large government contracts, relying on cooperation with the state to achieve many of his goals, and also being a big union buster. Now, it seems to me that when you look at Elon Musk and Henry Ford, these are people separated by about 100 years. They have a lot in common. They're both basically the owners of extremely large and powerful corporations that aren't subject to competition in the same ways that we would think of in a free market society. Much of their wealth comes from cooperation with governments, yet they both preach about free markets. They are both ardently anti-worker. They hate unions. They're famous for their union busting activities. And they're both fans of the far right. Why? Because far right politics helps to distract workers from the fact that they're being exploited by capital and instead redirect them to hating immigrants instead. So when you look at it in that sense, it's like, has a lot changed? Or actually, are we just kind of back at normal functioning capitalism?
That's kind of brings me to the point I've wanted to ask you about, Grace, is let's talk about the economy, but first from the commanding heights. And, David and I are Financial Times readers. And one thing that's concerned me is that Europe seems to be envious of our model of having people like Elon Musk go around and do all of this stuff. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on the American economy from across the Atlantic, because the Dems sure thought it was good enough to win an election last year. And I think we were saying, no, it's not. Look at rent prices, for instance. But relative to Europe, there's some dynamism in there. I would personally like to take more lessons from direct investment from like China's efforts towards batteries, for instance. I see Europe retreating from net zero initiative. So what's your perspective on the American economy? And is it because of if there is a dynamism there that isn't just a tech sector bubble, is that because we have planners like Elon Musk ready to step into the breach?
It's a really good question. And I think there's two ways to answer this question. The first is looking at, as you say, the commanding heights of the economy. And the second is then to look at the real economy, so the economy that everyone else experiences. When it comes to the kind of commanding heights of the American and European economies, there has been a different model there. And this is partly just underpinned by the fact that the US is the imperial power in global capitalism. What does that mean? It basically means that the US Army is the biggest in the world. It is responsible for defending property relations all over the world. And it does that through military force, but also through legal institutions, lots of different mechanisms for doing that. It is also obviously the home to the central bank that prints the world's reserve currency. So that creates an extraordinary, well, exorbitant privilege, as the term is often used, which allows the US to run this massive budget deficit with simultaneously with a current account deficit without much consequence. And it also allows it to be basically the world's financial hub. All of this comes together to basically make the US a very attractive destination for certain kinds of investment. And it just makes the economy much more dynamic. It means that, the finance sector is growing much more quickly. More companies want to be located in the US. And at the same time, Europe is flagging, and Europe has been flagging for quite a while. And there are a number of reasons for that. Obviously, Europe doesn't have the kind of same political structure as the US, and the political structure of the US is uniquely disposed to being used by capital for planning. So my book, Vulture Capitalism, is about how governments and big corporations and financial institutions work together to basically plan society. That is easier in the American system than it is in the European system, which is much more broken up. And you kind of see this in Europe's treatment of monopolies, for example, right? So the US is and has been really since the 80s, in fact, before that, extremely comfortable with the emergence of monopolies and the dominance of those monopolies over the economy. And it becomes self-reinforcing because those monopolies then are able to influence politics by pouring money into the bank accounts of particular politicians or lobbying or whatever. And that's created this self-reinforcing cycle, which ironically has actually made today, particularly the American financial markets, much more dynamic than those in the rest of the world, because basically you have about, 5 super extraordinarily massive companies that are propping up financial markets everywhere else. And when everyone else has investments in those companies, then, they're able to profit from that as well. In Europe, you don't have that same architecture that facilitates that kind of centralized planning in the same way. And they've taken a different attitude towards monopolies. There's been this kind of schizophrenia in Europe about how to treat monopoly power. Because on the one hand, there is this idea that Europe is committed to competition and that that's a really central part of what it means to have a European economy. But on the other hand, there have been lots of politicians who've been coming forward recently saying our companies can't compete with China's companies, with America's companies, because they've been allowed to agglomerate and centralize and get all this power together. And then there are others who come back and say, but that's not capitalism. Monopolies can't really exist under real capitalism. We need to actually keep these things broken up. So there's that kind of those political dynamics that exist in Europe that actually make it harder to perfect this kind of highly extractive, highly financialized, highly monopolistic model that you see working so well in the US for those at the top. Having said that, we are talking about the economy for those at the top, which is basically completely separate from what's happening for everyone else. So Trump can point to what's going on in financial markets and say, look how amazing we're doing. And it's basically because a handful of extremely wealthy, extremely powerful monopolies have been able to just extract profits, basically, from everyone else, from workers, from other parts of the world. And so when you look at the economy for everyone else, you see stagnant wages, high levels of debt, high prices, and a general sense of economic decline, particularly in kind of deindustrialized communities. That's only going to get worse as those at the top continue to have that stranglehold over the rest of the economy. Because, the more power they have, the easier it is for them to crush workers, prevent them from demanding higher wages, influence politics, just generally get what they want at the expense of everyone else. And that is also a problem in Europe, but in some ways it's less of a problem in Europe, certainly in some European countries that are slightly more insulated from those forms of pressure. So, I'm not saying that there's like a big gap between Europe and the US here, because it's a trend that exists very clearly in both economies. But I think the rage that is bubbling up at the kind of bottom of American society, which is responsible for the rise of people like Trump, it's gone further along in the US than it has in Europe, although much of Europe is catching up.
I have to ask you, Grace, and your description there, I think is perfect. And I've been reading you for years, and I think it's been an interesting experience on the left, like over this past decade, let's call it. And you know, I remember being very, very hopeful in certain moments and feeling very, very bleak in others. And I just sort of wanted to ask, like, before I maybe ask you a little bit about the left, I want to ask, like, okay, so we're seeing all these things, and the big story is capitalism, right? But have we experienced any kind of like market change in where the fights must be, right? Because I remember like when we were all sort of, you know, coming up, it was austerity was like the big thing, right? Like, can the state act? Will the state act? And now, again, like as we were saying, like it seems like that's less of the focus, but you know, the inequality is still there. So I'm just curious, like, you know, have things like changed in any kind of real way? Is there a new direction that we need to be focusing on in terms of like taking on this beast?
Things have changed massively. And in some ways, things have stayed the same. And we were just doing things wrong the first time around. So, you know, I think one of the reasons I wrote this book was in response to the movement that, you know, I kind of grew up in. I'm sure you guys all did as well, where the focus was, particularly here in the UK and Europe, against austerity, fighting austerity. And there was a very clear reason for that. You know, it was making people's lives dramatically worse and continues to do so, and has kind of screwed over our economy, particularly here in the UK. But it was put in place because it benefited those at the top, and it did so for a number of different reasons. Firstly, because it kind of disempowered workers at a time when you were seeing a real pushback against the kind of extractivist model that we had. So, you know, it made it harder for people to organize in their workplaces. It made it harder to do various other forms of organizing. It just made it harder to survive. And in doing so, kind of disempowered people. And it also kind of facilitated profit making in a number of different sectors. So like, you know, where governments cut public spending, powerful private corporations emerge to take on government contracts and then like skim a bunch of money on the top. So there were kind of very like obvious instrumental reasons why these policies were implemented that were about class power. But we didn't really talk about that. Instead, we were just like, the government is nice and will do good things for you, and we don't have enough government, right? And this isn't just a recent thing. This goes all the way back to the kind of Keynesian tradition that emerged around like the 1930s and was responsible for the kind of like sustainable capitalism we had in the wake of the Second World War. You know, this was a time when workers were much better organized, and economists like Keynes had come up with this new way of understanding the economy in which there was much more of a focus on demand. So, you know, if you cut government spending during a recession, it's going to scare everyone and they're not going to invest, and it's going to, you know, create a downward spiral. And this alliance between kind of Keynesian economists and the labor movement was responsible for that kind of, you know, New Deal politics in the US, what we call the kind of post-war consensus in the UK. And it really embedded this idea that the left was about getting this government to do things, and the right was the opposite of that, particularly when the neoliberals started to critique this model. And it was also helped, of course, by the Cold War, that context in which you had a capitalist economy and a socialist economy that you could counterpose. And we never really questioned and critiqued that. And the problem is that it's not really an accurate description of how capitalism works, because capitalism, as we've said, relies on on cooperation between states and big monopolies. And people know that. People are very aware of the fact that governments are often pretty corrupt, that they're in bed with powerful vested interests across the private sector, that politicians are much more likely to listen to people with money than they are ordinary voters. And when we went to people with this offer of give us your vote, the government will protect you and do nice things for you, people were kind of like, yeah, right. Like every politician I've ever known throughout my entire life has told me that. And most of the time, things haven't gone better. Now, this is actually kind of, this realization kind of led me into what is going to be my next book, because I basically think that the political emotion that is defining modern politics is this sense of powerlessness. So most people have problems in their lives that they know have something to do with the way our economy is organized. They don't have high enough wages. They can't afford to pay their rent, their bills. Maybe they can't get a job, whatever. And And they also have some sort of sense that like what is going on in wider society isn't good, that there are challenges that we all collectively face. But because we have this like highly individualized way of organizing things, you basically confront those problems as an isolated individual. We don't have the labor movement that we had in the past. We don't have strong social movements linked to political parties that we had in the past. And as a result of that, it's just like you sitting there in your bubble thinking everything's going wrong in my life and the world, but I'm only one person. What could I do to change that? I think that creates a deep sense of powerlessness, which basically the far right has exploited. It's basically said, everyone out there, the politicians, anyone who has a position of power and authority is part of this global conspiracy to keep you down by importing migrants and, pushing the trans agenda or whatever. And it provides this really convenient explanation as to why you feel so powerless. And the left has kind of responded to that by being like, well, actually, no, the government is nice and does nice things for you. When what we should have been saying was, throughout history, people like you have come together with other people like you to take on the vested interests that are making your life worse, to actually realize your collective power. You've organized in unions to demand higher wages. And if you haven't got that, you've gone on strike. You have organized in your communities and demanded certain things from your local government. You've organized yourself into political movements that have made massive changes. But because today we're all separated from one another and we feel that separation, we feel that loneliness and isolation as well as another big political problem, that's why you feel powerless. And the only way to move beyond that is to get people to organize, is to actually start fomenting that kind of real world politics that allows people to feel what it's like to resist. And I kind of really firmly believe that unless we're able to offer that on the left, the far right is the only option for people who are really pissed off at the status quo.
Grace,
so yeah.
I think you're like totally right on this. I mean, I'll say, Texas Monthly, one of the big magazines here, did a really great piece a couple years back where they went and they interviewed non-voters, right? And the way non-voters are always sort of portrayed as like, oh, they're so distracted by the television.
Yeah.
And they just, they're just not engaged in the real world. They went and they talked to folks, and like, yeah, of course there was like some stuff where like people didn't map perfectly on the political compass, but also, the American political compass doesn't really make a lot of sense either, frankly, in terms of like working class politics. But more importantly, all of these people actually like had a fairly good understanding of the world. But not only did they feel powerless, as you're saying, Grace, like a lot of them had believed and been burnt. Right. So a lot of people were like, oh, I, supported Obama in 2008. I thought my life was going to get better. My life got worse. And this is something that I think is not only, it's something that the left needs to be really serious about how to take this on. Because it's also very true. Sorry, I'm being very Texas centric here, but like that the right is taking advantage of it. Like the border part of Texas, right, which has traditionally been the Democrat stronghold here, swung pretty far to Trump. And these are like Mexican Americans, right, voting for Donald Trump. And a big part of it when they went and they did conversation with people was like, well, I've been supporting the Democrats my whole life, and nothing's particularly good has happened in it. So like, let's see what happens if we do this kind of thing. So I think you're totally right on this powerlessness thing. And it's abundantly clear that the right has been fairly equipped at taking advantage of this situation.
Yeah, it's that combination of, as you say, like that declining trust. Because I think you're right. When you've taken the time to go out and vote for someone, you've kind of already invested a little bit of like emotional energy in thinking, what will my life be like if this person gets elected? And when you keep like seeing that collapse, it's almost like getting your heart broken over and over again. And eventually you're just like, well, screw it. I can't be bothered anymore because it's, nothing good can come of this. And that then, creates this kind of nihilism of, well, nothing's going to change through politics. I can't change anything in my life. So what can we do? Well, there is this big, powerful leader who is telling me that he can kind of exercise strength on my behalf. I think that's what's really appealing about a guy like Trump. It's like you feel weak and powerless, but there's this big, strong billionaire who's going to go out there and be like, I'm a tough guy. And you can be like, that's my guy. Now I feel tough. I feel like I've got some power. And I think the only antidote to that is actually giving people a sense of what it really feels like to exercise power, i.e. through a movement that's making change in your community.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the Lucas plan, but one thing I've appreciated about old interview you did in Catalyst was there's two contradictory balance we need to sort of strike here, which is being clear-eyed about, say, what the government is and the system we live under, but also optimism. Like, socialists have a duty to communicate optimism, because I frankly am tired of seeing "we're so cooked" in the chats.
Yeah.
Like, we're cooked now. We've been cooked. We're cooking. But and can you just talk about that balance a little bit?
Oh my God, yes. So this is my guy, Tony Benn. And his answer to this question was, there is no final victory, just as there is no final defeat, just the same battle to be fought over and over again. And that kind of sounds maybe less optimistic, but it is. It's a real sense of like, we are part of this long struggle, and there are big ups and there are big downs. But if you take a step back and look at the things that social movements, labor unions, organized groups of people have achieved throughout history in a context arguably more scary than this. Imagine how terrifying it would have been to live through the Great Depression, literally not be able to afford to eat, lose your job, see people jumping out windows, and then go into the Second World War, where, vast swathes of your friendship groups would have been killed somewhere far away, and the rest would have come back completely changed forever. And it was in that context that working people came together across many different societies and basically said, we've had enough of an economic model that works for the rich and not for everyone else. We have, fought and struggled and suffered, and we want what's ours. And they were able to do that because they got organized and made those demands. So we exist in this very, very long struggle, and it's easy to look at where we are now and think it's unprecedentedly bad, but it's not. It's been bad for workers ever since the origins of capitalism itself. Think about the kids working in the factories in like the 1850s in industrializing England. Like, capitalism creates this kind of suffering, but it has also always created resistance to that suffering. It has always created or given rise to movements of people that have come together and said, we're not putting up with this anymore. And at the moment we start saying there's too much suffering, or the forces aligned against us are too powerful, we couldn't possibly even try to come together in the way we have in the past. That's when we're cooked. It's when we start saying we're so cooked that we can't do anything, that we actually are cooked. So like, stop bringing this world into being by saying that everything's going wrong. Like, this is, at the end of Vulture Capitalism, I have these 10 case studies of what I call examples of kind of democratic planning. So basically the argument is we live in this kind of oligarchic system of capitalist planning. What would it look like if we had a kind of democratic form of planning where communities, workers came together and said, this is how we want society to be organized? And then you say, oh, well, that's super utopian. And I say, well, here's 10 examples of people who've done that, from the Lucas Plan to the community wealth building movement to the participatory budgeting movement, things that have been happening all over the world. And the book I'm working on now about these questions of kind of individualism and powerlessness is just going to be mainly composed of examples of people from lots of different countries and lots of different places who are right now building movements to resist water privatization, to create cooperative communities for housing, to organize their workplaces, to provide care for people in their communities. Like, all of these incredible things that are happening right now, some of which are translating into political movements, some of which aren't, but which possibly will in the future. So it's like and I've been shocked, like, just reaching out to a few of the people I know across the left around the world, being like, what's going on in your place? They're like, well, things suck, but also this, and this is happening. And I'm like, wow, we don't hear about this. We don't talk about the cool things that are going on. Why not?
Yeah, I mean, just two things I'll name. The American Federation of Teachers, I believe, joined UAW's intention to strike on May Day in about 4 years. That's something that would have excited us so much if we heard like 10 years ago. So yeah. You know, there's a couple things. We don't have time, but there's a good section in your book where you talk about the limitations of Keynes and Hayek, the framing of economic debate, which was the dominant one that I certainly came into learning about economics on. And you know, you generally sort of shuffled over to Team Keynes if you're on the left, and it's like, you know, maybe there's some more to this than these two guys. But can you just outline the Lucas plan for folks? You go into it more deeply into your book.
Yeah, so another thing which Tony Benn was involved in. If you guys don't know him in the US, you should look him up. So the Lucas plan was basically, there was an aerospace company in the UK called Lucas Aerospace, and it was threatened by rising competition from abroad. The workers at the factory were worried that the firm was going to go under. So they approached Tony Benn, who was then a minister in the Labour government, and said, can you nationalise us? And Ben said, we don't think we can do that, but why don't you guys go away and think up a plan as to how you could kind of reorganise the company? And then we'll see what we can do working with you from there. They did that. They went away and they asked the workers at Lucas Aerospace, what do you think we should do with the company? And the response they got was like, astonishing. These were just ordinary workers from all over the country, and they were like, we don't want to produce weapons anymore. We want to produce socially useful technologies. These are the things that we work with every day. These are the resources that we have. These are how they can be used to produce wind turbines, produce kidney dialysis machines, produce health tech, whatever. And the union leaders put all these ideas together in a document, and worked with people within the organization to come up with a transition plan, to think about how this could be a worker-owned company, like a number of worker-owned companies that exist all around the world today. And they produced this crazy radical document that was basically like, took aim at the kind of fundamental thing that makes capitalism, which is the divide between workers and owners. Now, we never really got to see what would happen with this, because not long after the Lucas Plan was published, Margaret Thatcher, our Reagan, got into power. And she was all about freedom, right? They were about free markets, individual freedom, allowing everyone to kind of pursue their best sense of what their best life is. But when it came to the workers at Lucas Aerospace exercising their freedom, that was a step too far. The union leaders were basically removed for spending too much time on union businesses. They were crushed as part of this broader attack on the labour movement that Thatcher imposed when she came into power. And for a while, the people who've been involved in it tried to get projects started in other places. So they went to London, worked with the GLC, the Greater London Council, to create people's technology networks, which were about bringing together small businesses with local governments and workers to kind of see what the technology needs of different communities were, and then put those into practice. Thatcher then shut down the GLC. So this movement for democratic planning was fundamentally threatening to the interests of capital, not only because it was about pulling power down from the top, but also because it threatened their narrative. Their narrative was like, we are giving you freedom. That's our thing. So when workers decided to take that freedom and use it in ways that those at the top didn't like, they couldn't have that. It undermined this distinction that they built up in their heads, which is the left is about control, the right is about freedom. And I start my book actually with another example of an aerospace company, Boeing, which many of you may have heard of, basically which knowingly produced planes that fell out of the sky, killing several hundred people. Lucas Aerospace was chopped up in the shareholder value revolution of the 1980s, and part of what was once Lucas Aerospace was bought by a company that produced the faulty sensors for the Boeing planes that caused them to crash, killing all those people. And I'm basically like, those are the two paths we have, like democratic, socially useful technology for public good, or a powerful monopoly that produces planes that fall out of the sky. Those are the two options for economic models, not big state, small state, not free markets, centralized planning. It's like democratic people power or corporate control.
It's a fascinating sort of glimpse into a different future, because it's one that I think could be very persuasive to anybody who's worked at these corporations. Do you think, like, I'm thinking about Boeing, Alphabet, Facebook, Intel, these companies that have like basically bloated themselves out of being competitive. I think probably the workers and the engineers and stuff of at those corporations, if they were empowered, maybe we'd be, doing smarter things than VR characters on Facebook that don't have legs or
100%.
something.
I had a friend who worked in tech, and I won't say where, but they had, they're very smart and they had an interesting job, and basically one of their projects was like how to get Domino's to keep up with your conversation so that it could ping you with an alert to order Domino's, right?
Oh my god!
And you just talk about like what your life is like. I mean, it's a kind of miserable use of your energies and intellect.
Yeah.
All this insane technology.
Yeah, that's what our intelligent people are doing when they could be thinking about how we tackle climate breakdown or just like building useful things. It's crazy.
I mean, the AI stuff is driving me crazy because, again, like I think there might be some useful things, but the applications that I'm seeing pitched as revolutionary are you'll be able to have them book vacations for you online. So it's going to be able to use Expedia for you 1,000 times better than you could as a human. Like, okay, I can't wait for that.
Yeah.
Grace Blakeley, Vulture Capitalism is the most recent book. Is there anything else people should be looking out for you? I mean, I'm anxious to read that next book.
Yeah, so the next book won't be out for a while, but in the meantime, I've set up a Substack where I am basically going to be highlighting different examples of kind of grassroots struggles for economic justice from all around the world, and it's called What Can We Do? wcwd.substack.com.
Very good. We'll include the link to that. Thank you so much, Grace.
Thanks, guys.
Good, David. Good to be with you.
Yeah, man. It's always great seeing you. And we're really thrilled to be joined by return guest to the program, Assal Rad, who is a scholar and author of the Middle East, and also return guest on this program, somebody who you should certainly be reading and following if you aren't already. Assal, we always appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Happy to be back.
I mean, there's a lot for us to get to, and I sort of want to talk about the Trump administration, sort of where things are at. But before we get there, first and foremost, I wanted to sort of get your read on what's been going on with this ceasefire with Israel, because we've heard this kind of announcement about a ceasefire, and yet we've still seen some pretty horrific things coming out of Gaza.
Yeah, so we have a ceasefire, at least on the surface. I mean, it has had the impact where now you're getting a lot more trucks, aid trucks coming into Gaza, which is significant for the entire population. You have people being able to actually return. I mean, I'm using the phrase return to their homes, but there are no homes for them to return to. I think the statistics are something like 2/3 almost of Gaza buildings in Gaza have either been destroyed or damaged. So, but at least there's a little bit more freedom of movement where people can go back to the rubble where their homes used to be. And we've seen the daily killings obviously come down. The reason I'm saying, on the surface a ceasefire is because you're still seeing Palestinians being killed. Like Israel is still killing Palestinians in Gaza, and the Israeli military is still in Gaza. In that sense, it's actually really interesting because it is an example of the sort of narrative of, October 6th, there was a ceasefire. We kept hearing this over and over again. There was a ceasefire on October 6th. Hamas started this war, this kind of language that's used. And the reality on the ground, of course, was that if you're Palestinian in Gaza, you're under blockade. If you're Palestinian in West Bank, you're directly under military occupation. If you're in East Jerusalem, it's the same thing. You're being expelled from your homes. There's ethnic cleansing. There's apartheid. Killing is happening. It's part of like a daily life and existence. So the fact that that narrative was used always to describe everything before October 7th is really interesting when you look at it now. Like, we are theoretically under a ceasefire, yet Palestinians are still being killed. So that was always the idea of what it means to be under a ceasefire. It's a ceasefire, but Palestinians can still be killed, and it's considered a ceasefire. Have those numbers come down greatly from the daily death tolls we were seeing? Yes. the sort of daily bombardment that we were seeing has stopped. And I think one of the really important stories about the ceasefire is the aid. I think the last report I saw is 2,400 trucks have gotten in. This is after months and months and months of Biden officials telling you, well, the problem is security. It's not that Israel isn't allowing the aid in. It's that there's no, as long as Hamas is there, as long as there's no security, the looting will continue, and there's nothing that can be done. There's nothing to do with what Israel is doing. And yet, the security situation has not changed. And there are hundreds of trucks coming in every day all of a sudden. So I think in this very short period of time, we're also starting to see more of the destruction. Like, we've known this, we've seen these daily horrors, but you can't understand the level and magnitude until people can really go in, until things settle, until the dust, so to speak, settles, and people can see the extent to which destruction and death has taken place. Like families who are going back to their homes and finding the remains of loved ones that they have been cut off from for maybe months.
I mean, it's actually, like, just given how horrifying the images that we have gotten outside of Gaza have been, that things we've seen on social media, all these kind of reports, thinking about the fact that, yes, once you get people like able to go on the ground and get Western press in there in the way that they haven't been, to think, what else is going to be found is just, it's hard to wrap your head around. And I mean, on this, I'm curious, just how, one thing that I've heard some people sort of note is that now that it is Trump, that Trump is the president, that certain parts of the American press, at least, might be more willing to sort of cover negative stories about Israel. And I'm curious if that's something, that you're sort of expecting.
The thing is, the sort of extremist, right? The fanatic kind of pro-Israel stance that exists in the United States is bipartisan. Mm-hmm. There's no question to that fact. At the same time, I would expect a lot of media outlets to be more critical of Trump than they were of Biden, because we've seen that already in the past, right? We saw that on the flip side when we had the first Trump administration and then the Biden admin came in, and when Biden took a lot of actions that were really a continuation of the policies under the Trump administration, it wasn't treated the same way in the media. So while I will not be surprised if there is a difference in the way that media treats Trump, even when the same policies are enacted, I think overall what you'll still see is that consistency of, a very anti-Palestinian, pro-Israel stance that is really lopsided in one direction.
This is a pretty important period. We're seeing more and more images, like you said, and it does look like a Hiroshima or a Dresden, sort of the complete, and then bodies everywhere. That's a result that Israel would probably rather do without. Like, is there anything is it something that, I guess, how do we use this moment to draw as much attention to that as possible, or is it kind of the thing where it might just eventually recede into the background?
Do you mean recede into the background in terms of the way the media is covering it?
Yeah, and a chance to maybe convey more imagery than has been available before the ceasefire.
Well, you would think that. I mean, look, the reality is the Palestinian journalists on the ground have been giving us the footage the entire time, and you've had. It's not that there's no coverage in Western media sources, but what's interesting about it is there's also a difference between if you go out and search, right? If I Google and I search and I try to find articles from CNN or BBC videos from CBS News, all these different sort of mainstream news sources, you'll find videos of what is going on in Gaza. Obviously, all of it coming from the footage from Palestinian journalists on the ground. But then if you compare it to the way it's covered on their social media platforms, that's the interesting point too, right? There's no attention being drawn to it. The stories are there if you're seeking them out, but they're not on the television screens. They're not on social media. They're not amplifying these stories. And then when you do find them, even when you search and you do find them, the language that's used is often problematic. And it's still not it's not covering the magnitude, because you have to think about the fact that people are being killed in the dozens on a daily basis. On a daily basis, children are being slaughtered. Those stories are not being shared consistently or all the time. So I don't know. I would assume that this period that we're looking at, where there might be, and we don't know if there will be, but where there might be more access from foreign press. I mean, I don't see any reason why Israel would want to see that happen. Why would they suddenly want foreign press or independent investigations when they've been denying it this entire time? So the likelihood of that happening, that's something to look for too. I would expect the coverage to remain the same, though. So even when they have access, even when they can cover things, it probably, you won't see the same wall-to-wall coverage you would see if you're suddenly uncovering, you know, a genocide that's not being committed with U.S. weapons and money by a U.S. ally. And so I don't expect that kind of coverage to change all that much. The other thing to keep in mind is, like, we're talking about a ceasefire as if it's over. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that is not, we're just at the early stages. I mean, even Trump himself, when asked, is he confident about a ceasefire? No. You've had Israeli media reporting for not just weeks, but for months, that Netanyahu is saying outright, we should be upfront about the fact that we're going to resume the war. So you might have a ceasefire deal right now, and that came because of pressure from Trump wanting to see a ceasefire before his inauguration, right? Before he takes his second term as president. And that's exactly what we saw. We saw the power of a US president to force something to happen because they actually do have power. You wouldn't know that had you been paying attention to the Biden admin, because they acted like they were impotent and couldn't do anything the entire time. Like they were having these really tough conversations, and yet Israel's actions changed in no way, shape, or form. But as soon as Trump sort of puts even a little bit of pressure, right? It's not real pressure. It's not like he didn't come out and say, we're not going to give you weapons or we're not going to fund you. In fact, in many ways, Trump's previous administration, and even what we've seen so far, is someone who, because he does not care about international law or norms, would give more of a blank check, if that's even possible, to Israel, at least publicly in his discourse, right? Something like rescinding sanctions on the handful of settlers in the West Bank the Biden administration put on, really for show, because it's meaningless. But, you know, at least the Biden admin will come and say, well, we put these sanctions on like a number of individuals. Of course, they didn't put sanctions on the military or the institution that makes the occupation possible and facilitates settler violence, but they picked a handful of settlers to make it look like they did something. Trump won't even do that, you know? So it's a very interesting dynamic. It's so early in the administration to be able to tell what he's going to do, but already you can see this, what makes him so unpredictable, right? On one hand, he's taken a tough stance on the ceasefire. And there was reports yesterday in Israeli media that while Netanyahu had asked for an extension of the ceasefire terms in Lebanon, the Trump administration was basically like, no, we're not going to grant that extension. And so already you're seeing, in some ways, a tougher stance, but then you see the other things that he's doing, like lifting sanctions on settlers in the West Bank. So I imagine that's the confusion that's going to guide us for at least for a little while, until we see what direction this admin plans to go in.
You know, I just wanted to note one quick thing about the media coverage that you were sort of talking about when it comes to social media. Like, all this is out there, and I just want to remind people that if you go and you read major newspapers and websites all across the U.S., a vast majority of reporting now is getting sourced from things that people see on Twitter. Right. So like the lack of reporting that we have seen on Gaza from like the mainstream news sites, from like the major cable news sites, you know, is a deliberate decision, because they're happy to do that about all other kinds of stories. But for some reason, when, you know, it's Palestinians documenting what Israel is doing to them, then it's, you know, quote unquote bias source or whatnot. But
let me add something to that so we can get a full picture of just how ridiculous the coverage is. The argument, I guess, the counter argument, which is ridiculous, that would be used as what you just said, which is, well, those are biased sources. They're Palestinian sources. Those are biased. Ridiculous. But let's assume that argument. What about the fact that a publication like the New York Times just didn't publish an article about Human Rights Watch coming out and saying that Israel is committing genocide? Just did not publish anything about it, as if one of the most significant human rights organizations on the planet saying Israel is committing genocide is just not newsworthy, apparently. Or the way that when Amnesty came out with the same report, or a UN Commission report came out in November saying Israel is committing genocide, right? Israel's actions are consistent with genocide. Look at the lack of coverage there. You can't argue about those sources. I mean, some people will, I should say that. Some people will argue that all of those sources are biased too, but that's when we get to this sort of absurd logic that anyone that criticizes Israel is biased. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the world's leading human rights organizations, international institutions, international courts, experts in various fields, everybody is the Pope. You know, you have to assume that everyone is biased then, only if they're actually being critical of Israel. So it goes far beyond them not covering or not using sources from Palestinian sources, but just not covering information that is coming out from obviously recognized, like respectable institutions.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask, and I know this is like a large amount of stuff to kind of survey, but for people who might need to be kind of caught up, I mean, this is all going to touch on Gaza because this has been something that has like affected so many other countries and so many people. I mean, in fact, I think no doubt about it, the American election. But I'm curious if you could give people kind of, you know, general lay of the land now that Trump is coming to power regarding like Syria, Lebanon, and Iran as well.
It's sort of hard to tell because
even without like we don't even need to get into predicting. I mean, just catching some folks up who might sort of be a little behind there as well.
So what you've seen from Trump so far, right, without the predictions, just what we've actually seen is, for instance, I mentioned Lebanon, right? So at Lebanon, we're supposed to be coming to the end. I mean, Israel's supposed to be withdrawing its troops by Sunday, January 26th, I believe, 26th or 27th. Like within the next few days, Israel's supposed to withdraw its troops. They're asking for an extension, of course, because they don't want to withdraw their troops. They want to maintain as much land occupation in the region as they can. So far, we're seeing the Trump admin saying no to that. We'll have to see how that plays out. On the Syrian front, Israel is still occupying far beyond, I mean, what they call a buffer zone, which is ridiculous because the Golan Heights is Syrian territory and Israel has occupied it for decades. It is not, I mean, the Trump administration can, and then actually the Biden admin after that, can recognize the Golan Heights as part of Israel if they want, but it goes against international law. So it's not internationally recognized as Israeli territory, it's Syrian territory. That has been occupied. Now Israel has not only gone into the buffer zone, but beyond the buffer zone in Syria. That, I mean, there are very open calls for a permanent occupation, for annexing that land as well. So that's on the Syrian front. Obviously, we have the decimation in Gaza. Now, since the ceasefire, we're seeing escalating violence in the West Bank, Israel launching a new military campaign in the West Bank. West Bank has also been occupied for decades. Increased checkpoints, raids, shelling, things that are Palestinians that are being killed in larger numbers now in the West Bank. This all in the backdrop of people's attention being on Gaza, obviously. But this is just an escalation. It's not like everything was peaceful in the West Bank and suddenly this started. It's just escalating now at the where we see ourselves right now. On the Iranian front, it seems interesting because it looks like, and again, this is very early to tell, but if we're looking at what we have so far, that Trump is pursuing a diplomatic angle at resolving, you know, something like a new nuclear deal or some kind of diplomatic resolution to the tensions with Iran. The center of that being Iran having a nuclear program and the US wanting to prevent Iran from deciding to weaponize that program, which, as we're speaking right now, there is no evidence that Iran has weaponized that program, according to US intelligence, I should say. The fact that there is a administration on the Iranian side that has also signaled that it's open to dialogue is maybe favorable, because one of the problems sort of on the Iranian American sides is they often don't line up. There's on one side, they're open to dialogue, on the other side, they reject it, or vice versa. And right now, if we take what we've seen so far from the Trump administration to be true, then you may see that line up now, which would be, what we saw the first time in Trump 1.0, what we saw was someone who came in and wanted to reverse and be distinct from his predecessor, which was at the time Barack Obama. If he follows that same path now, which seems to be what he would want to do, then, and this is at least the discourse that he has used, he wants to end all of these wars. He wants the war in Ukraine to end. He wants the war in Gaza to end. He wants to have a deal with Iran, because basically that'll give him the ability to come out and say, look, I did everything they couldn't do. I ended all of these things.
I think I can definitely see what you're getting at. I mean, that's like been a lot of the reporting here, that's been, it's kind of early days, obviously. I have to ask, I mean, domestically in Iran, how difficult will a kind of a deal with Trump, I mean, the person who assassinated Soleimani, be to sort of sell to people?
Domestically, I don't actually think that. So that specific point will be objected to by a minority within the population, right? Because it'll be sort of like the hardliners will take the stance of, Trump assassinated Soleimani, and so we can't negotiate with this person. I think that represents more of a hardline view that actually cares deeply about the fact that he assassinated Soleimani. I think within the larger population, you'll also see some differences where there's probably one camp that would like to see the economic situation improve, right? And I think that typically, even if you take the Iranian populace out of it and you just think across the board, what was the number one factor in our own election? We can talk about Gaza, we can talk about genocide, we can talk about all sorts of things. The reality of it is the number one issue for Americans was the economy. And so that's going to be the case with everybody, right? People are always worried about their basic necessities over anything else. And so sanctions relief and the potential for Iran's economy to improve would definitely be something that I think would have appeal for a lot of the population. Now, I say that, and I would add that there's probably another camp that doesn't want to see negotiations, not for the same reasons as the hardliners, right? Not because, but he assassinated Soleimani, but they don't want to see negotiations because they don't want anything that might engage with the Islamic Republic and therefore keep it in power, under the belief that there is some alternative, or somehow it can be overthrown, and even that it'll split into different camps again, right? I would say it's a minority view, but people who might support, for instance, military intervention, regime change from the outside. I think that's a minority view in Iran. But, it's a massive country. We're talking about nearly 90 million people, right? 85 million people. They're going to have a diverse set of views, but those are the few nuances that I think are important to understand. But specifically in terms of negotiating with Trump because of Soleimani, I think that would be more of like a hardline view.
Yeah, I can definitely see how achieving a deal would be very popular, probably also in the U.S. With normal people. Maybe not as much with the freaks. On that, we've talked about this when you please, yeah.
You say that because actually, like, everything I just said sort of flip side works too, right? Like, if you think about how would the American populace respond to a deal with Iran, it's very similar. Like, you'll have the sort of hawkish hardline views in the US that's like, you can't negotiate with them because you just can't. They're morally repugnant and therefore you can't negotiate with them. You can negotiate with everybody else who's morally repugnant and arm them, but you can't negotiate with these people. Then you'll have people who will be like, thank God, right? Like, we don't have to have a war. We get to avoid anything like that. And Iran's not going to have nuclear weapons. And then you'll have people who will also be sort of part of that. No, we should just get rid of the Islamic Republic camp. So it's very similar They're sort of mirror images of each other in the sense of the types of thinking that you'll see across the political spectrum. But I would argue that a majority on both sides would like to avoid conflict, war, and see, I mean, if you're on the Iranian side, see your daily life improve through economic improvement.
Which I mean, there's a few other things I was hoping to get to before we let you go. But if you could just remind people, we've had you on the program. I'll link to our other interviews here for folks. But I mean, you can agree with me or disagree with me, but like, I think it is repugnant, the fact that Joe Biden did not make an effort to undo what Trump did. It's politically no brainer. Could you just help people who are less familiar with this understand like the real suffering, that Joe Biden maintaining that Trump tearing up the nuclear deal has meant for everyday Iranians?
Look, so I just brought up the fact that there's probably like a population of people in Iran who don't want negotiations because they're so fed up and angry and frustrated that they just want to get rid of this government, however, by any means necessary, and therefore they don't want engagement, right? Now, let's go back to 2016. This is the same country, it's the same people, it's the same government. People in Iran celebrated the nuclear deal. There's just no question to this. Like, you can look at footage, you can anecdotally look at things, you can look at election results, how many people participated in elections in 2013 and 2017 as comparatively to the last two elections, and the fact that you had massive voter turnout then, which typically is seen as like a mandate, right? When people actually go out to vote, it means that they're voting for something. And then you could just look at polling. Everything across the board shows you that it was very, very popular, the nuclear deal with the United States. And obviously it's the P5+1. It's a global, it's an international accord. But the fact that the US was involved in it was significant for Iranians because they saw it at the time, not just because of the economic relief from sanctions, but also as this turning point, right? It was the detente between Iran and the US was huge for Iranians. They thought this is going to be a turning point. Things are going to change now. Because it was also understood at the time, for those who were within the sort of pro-diplomacy camps, that the JCPOA wasn't a ceiling, but a floor to diplomacy, right? It was the beginning, and you could build on it. And so when Trump withdraws from the deal about 2 years later, and not only reimposes sanctions, but unleashes this notion of maximum pressure, it hurt. And this was predictable, right? Every analyst at the time, not every analyst, I take that back. How can I say this? Pro-diplomacy analysts, I guess. I want to say honest analysts, honestly, said this would hurt ordinary people more than anybody else. And that's not just in the case of Iran. That's typically how sanctions work. You can look at reports by sanctions experts. Even proponents of sanctions will tell you that the evidence shows in terms of efficacy, they don't work more than they work, if that makes sense, right? Most of the time they don't work, especially when they're unilateral. And that's what the US did under the Trump administration in 2018. So you saw massive inflation, just the currency has basically become worthless. Millions of people from the middle class forced into poverty. Lack of access to, not only are goods very expensive, but the goods on the market have changed. Even medicines, right? Like even the humanitarian carve-outs, things that are not supposed to be sanctioned, like essential goods, were. And this is something, by the way, that Joe Biden said. Go back to 2020. You know who said that despite the humanitarian exceptions and sanctions, essential goods were being impeded because of US sanctions? Joe Biden said that when he was a candidate. And guess who didn't lift any of those sanctions? Joe Biden. So the economic situation is very, very dire for the population at large. The Islamic Republic is still in power. And economically, they don't really suffer because they have the ability to get around these sanctions. They can do it. They can sell oil on the black market. They can do these things. Ordinary people can't get around them and can't do anything. So yeah, that's the sort of gravity of the situation that Iranians find themselves. Now, on top of that, domestically, They have an authoritarian, repressive government. We've seen protests in 2019 and 2022 sparked by different reasons, right? In 2019 because of economic reasons, in 2022 because of social reasons, the hijab, the mandatory hijab for women after the killing of Masa Amini. So they have very large and significant and legitimate grievances across the board, but the economic situation has been exacerbated by sanctions without a doubt. There's no doubt to that. That's just the evidence. I mean, US administrations have actually boasted about that fact. Like, look, our sanctions are working. Their economy is terrible. Mm-hmm. So this is the information. This is what our own officials in the US are saying about their sanctions policy.
The Iran deal has always been one of the best legacies of Obama. Like, looking back on it, especially after Biden's term, is it almost surprising how it got done at all? Like, how did that get through?
Like I said, remember I said they're usually not aligned. Like, if you look at the history of Iran and the US from the post-revolutionary era, right, like post-1979, there has been a lot of attempts at engagement actually from the Iranian side. There have been many attempts at engagement, and it has usually been rebuffed by repeated US administrations. And we could, dedicate a whole other hour to talking about all of that history and why that happened the way that it did. I think obviously one part of that history that plays into it so much on the American side is the embassy seizure of 1979, right? That was a national humiliation. It was a national crisis that went on for 444 days. It was the major reason why Jimmy Carter did not get reelected. Similarly to sort of what we saw in the ceasefire, the fact that the ceasefire went into effect right as Trump was being inaugurated is precisely what we saw in 1980 when Reagan was taking office, right? Basically the hostages were held until Reagan was inaugurated as president, and then they were released. So that is a very important historical moment in the American psyche. Of course, like I said, we could talk about this for a long time. That is directly related historically to something that's part of the Iranian psyche, which is the 1953 coup, that CIA-led, CIA, US, UK, that removed its democratic prime minister and reimposed a dictator, the Shah. So there's a lot, that's why I said there's so much we can sort of unpack about it. But the problem has been this alignment. And what you saw under the Obama administration is they finally aligned. There was a moderate Hassan Rouhani, who was in the administration then, the foreign minister was Jawad Zarif. And for them, the crowning achievement was the JCPOA. This is what they had worked for. This is what they had promised people. Because again, it was, for the Iranian side, it was about economic relief, which was vital, very, very important, but also a pivot, a change, because so many of the people who were against, and I'm talking about on the US side, on the American side, so many of the pundits you would listen to would say things like, Iran can't be trusted. Iran would never negotiate with the US. Iran would never abide by a deal. And now we have a very unique sort of historical situation where we know as a fact that none of that is true. Iran did negotiate with the US. They sat at the table and had dialogue with the United States. They signed an agreement and they abided by that agreement. So much so that Trump admin certified the deal multiple times before they pulled out of it in May of 2018. And so that means when they certified the deal, they were saying Iran is abiding by it, right? A key thing, since we're sort of catching people up, the key thing to keep in mind, like what happened in the Trump administration is Trump changed his Secretary of State. Under Rex Tillerson, who was the original Secretary of State under Trump 1.0, the US stayed in the deal and certified it. It was within 2 weeks of Mike Pompeo taking over as Secretary of State that the US withdrew from the deal. And of course, if you know anything about Mike Pompeo, he is basically an extremist, right? He's a religious extremist. He has highly ideological points of view that color his idea of foreign policy. He was asked if he thought God had brought Trump to protect Israel from Iran, and he responded basically that he had to entertain that idea as a believer. It was a possibility. Yeah. Like, this is what your Secretary of State is saying. these are the things that we criticize, by the way, right? If a cleric in Iran was to make a similar statement, this would be criticized across the board in the United States. But the Secretary of State can say that, and we're sort of like, okay.
You know, something happens when it's that far away, you know, over the ocean, you know.
They're religious fanatics. We're pragmatic politicians.
Just like the founders.
Yeah, I mean,
he makes the same argument about, he was the one that basically said, I mean, he recognized settlements in the West Bank, the first U.S. administration to go against the entire international community to do so, because he's using essentially a biblical justification for why that land does not apparently belong to Palestinians. So this is the kind of thinking that you had at that time that, again, made it impossible for the two sides to come to any kind of agreement. That is why it was actually very interesting to see that Trump did not bring Mike Pompeo back to this administration. We'll have to see how Secretary of State Rubio, who's also hawkish on Iran, very, very pro-Israel, Trump did not bring a cabinet that's necessarily that different, I should say, but if there's more pragmatism within their thinking rather than strictly ideological, then there might be space, especially because Biden failed to do it. So what a great sort of endorsement of his presidency it would be if he, again, accomplishes something that Biden failed to do.
and also I will say this is not a prediction that Rubio is going to be good on anything. But if you look at Rubio has always struck me as a bit of a climber instead of a true believer. You see about how he's sort of tried to attach himself to some of these like right-wing populism, not Trump-style right-wing populism, like Compact Magazine right-wing populism stuff, right? And like, you know, it's a little 1 foot in, 1 foot out, but he does strike me as somebody who wants to sort of rise up. And if that's how you rise up in the Trump administration, you know, maybe he'll go, but I don't know. It's tough because his history obviously has been so hawkish. It's hard to know what's going to happen with these folks because all of these things that we're talking about, you know, the ceasefire, and then Trump is signing executive orders, and he's talking about how beautiful Gaza is and how it'd be great to build properties there. Right? Some of the most horrific things. He used Palestinian as a slur as president. I mean, it's very difficult to know what is happening. But
because he doesn't have a political ideology. That's what makes him so unpredictable, right? Like that's not what he doesn't care. Like I said, he doesn't care about international law. He doesn't care about human rights. He doesn't care about democracy. And I say that as if the Democrats care about any of those things. And I'm going to tell you that they don't. They clearly don't care about any of those things either, but they know how to talk like they care about it, right? They clearly don't care about international law. They oversaw a genocide. They don't care about human rights. They oversaw a genocide. And they don't care about democracies because bipartisan, Republican or Democrat, administration after administration has, you know, great relationships with authoritarian states everywhere in the world. So that is, but what makes Trump unique is that he's not a politician and he doesn't try to even use that political discourse. I mean, there are clips of him where, you know, the fact that he will meet with, you know, the way he talks about Putin, just the way he expresses things, and he'll be called out about it. Like, but those people are, you know, they've done this, they've done that. And his response has been things like, well, we've done bad things too. Like, he just says it. And that's not something that you typically see from politicians in the U.S.
I mean, after, you know, there's part of it that after what we just experienced with the Biden administration, I mean, really some of the worst talking out of both sides of your mouth that I've seen in politics, and, you know, through Bush, Trump 1 and Obama. I mean, I should know better, but I have been pretty shocked at how despicable the Biden administration was about Gaza.
I would put them as worse than the Bush administration, and that might be a controversial take, but I'm going to say it because not because they are worse, but because it was more obvious. Like, because of social media, because of the way that information was readily available to people. I mean, the information was happening in real time. Like, in real time, they were
lying. I mean, they were. Yeah.
You're just lying. This is. State Department officials were saying, we're resigning because you're lying. Like, that's not what happened under the Bush administration. You didn't have multiple resignations happen because they were coming out and telling the public, they are lying to you. There are no weapons of mass destruction. That wasn't happening in the same way. It's not that they didn't know that there were lies happening, but what I'm saying is when you compare the sort of public PR disaster, right? There was more unity around, at least within the administration itself, around Bush than you saw even within, like I said, within the Trump, the Biden administration. The fact that you had State Department officials coming out and saying, I'm resigning because you lied to Congress about the fact that Israel is blocking aid. You don't have that equivalent then. And so I think that's what makes it so egregious. It's like, but you're telling me not to believe the thing that I'm seeing with my own eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we are seeing children being slaughtered, and you're saying, well, I don't have any confidence in those numbers. What do you, they're right there. We're all seeing it.
And I think it was, I think it really exposed a kind of rot in American liberalism that I think a lot of people suspected was there, but I think it was shown. And we've had Prem Thacker on the program recently to sort of talk about the work that they've done in the White House. At these press briefings, and it is truly shocking and sort of spiritually difficult, frankly. But Assal, before we let you go, I have just one quick one. Yeah, of course. Yeah, yes, please.
Because I watched, I tortured myself, and I watched all of those press briefings. And Prem, along with many other journalists that were in the room, but was one who really pushed back. And I say that because I am so critical of the media, and I am so critical of journalists. And I think it's important to distinguish between journalists who are trying to do the work, who are asking the questions, who are being denied answers, and the institutions, right? Mm-hmm. The media institutions that don't allow them to do their jobs. But I thought Prem did just a fantastic job of basically calling out their BS in the briefings.
Prem is great, and also a fellow North Dakotan, right, Matt?
No, one of our best. Yep.
So, just last thing before we let you go. What are you going to be? What would you suggest people who want to sort of keep up with what might be happening, obviously with Gaza, but with Iran, with the entire region? Like, what are things that are on your mind that you're sort of wanting to watch and have questions that you might have over the next couple of weeks to sort of feel out what we might be seeing over the next few years?
I mean, the questions for me are, I cannot predict this man at all. And I generally don't like predictions because there's no point in the
it's
nature
one of those things. Even if you get it right, you're also probably wrong. You know what I mean?
It's very difficult to predict things, especially in these conflicts are unpredictable by their nature, and then you add to it this sort of factor that is Donald Trump, who is just not predictable at all himself. So it's hard to see. I do think that one piece of the puzzle that is significant is Iran. Mm-hmm. Because one of the way that we talk about Israel policy and Iran policy compartmentalizes them in the US, usually when we're talking about it, the reality of it is they're directly connected, right? They're the flip side of the same coin. You have to be hawkishly anti-Iran and at the same time just hawkishly pro-Israel. Like those two things go together. Because in part what administration after administration has done, with the exception of the Obama administration, is an attempt to isolate Iran, right? The idea was always, we're not going to normalize anything with this state. They're an abnormal state, and so that's how they're going to be treated until we can figure out a way of basically getting rid of them. And that just hasn't happened over 46 years, right? That has not happened yet. Now, you can predict the same thing every year, and maybe eventually you're right, but we've been hearing this now for multiple decades, and it has not happened yet. So how he goes about dealing with Iran, I think, will tie into other things, because if you really want a security architecture in the region, you can't ignore any of them, right? Mm-hmm. You can't. It would be the same thing. It's the same problem that you have on the Iranian side. Like, if the Iranian side says, we want a security architecture, but we're going to ignore Israel. Like, you can't do that. And everyone understands that. Everyone sees what's problematic about the Iranian side when they try to do that. So you have to be able to see it on this side. I mean, this is a gigantic country in the middle of the region. You can't just get rid of it or ignore it. And so what would be to the greatest benefit for the region as a whole is some kind of detente all around. And that's what you've seen in some ways starting to happen in the region itself, like the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for instance, which are often sort of framed as these rivals. They are pragmatic rivals within the region, but there's an understanding that on their own parts that they haven't just been able to defeat the other. And so there has to be some level of cooperation. So I think if he can take that pivot, then that might change the way things go. But if we go back to the sort of isolate Iran, support Israel no matter what, then we're likely to just repeat what's happened, what we saw the Biden admin do, and basically what's been going on for a very long time in terms of U.S. policy vis-a-vis the region.
Well, Assal, we appreciate speaking with you as always. Folks, there are links below to keep up with their work. Assal, thank you.
Thank you guys for having me.
Folks, patreon.com/Left Reckoning. David Griscom and I will be there for you in about 5 minutes with the post-game show. So go subscribe to us at patreon.com/.